am what I would consider to be a casual DC fan. By that I mean I rather love Batman. I've seen quite a few DC films and I'll happily watch them, but there are still quite a good few that I haven't seen. I'm also a big animation fan, so I was really looking forward to the DC League of Super Pets. Honestly, I seem to not have enjoyed it as most people. It has 7.6 out of 10 on IMDb, which is a lot higher than I was expecting. Not that I thought it was terrible, but it just didn't live up to my expectations, to be perfectly honest. It was released this year, 2022, directed by Jared Stern and Sam J. Levine. We also have this absolutely brilliant voice cast. To name just a few: Dwayne Johnson, Kevin Hart, Keanu Reeves, Olivia Wilde, Yvette Nicole Brown. Really brilliant voice cast. And the voice acting was the high quality that I was expecting. And the quality of the animation is beautiful. The soundtrack as well is something that I thought was really great. Where I felt like it wasn't as good as it could have been, there were two main things. The first is the narrative. I felt like it just wasn't as smooth and slick as it could have been, but it wasn't terrible. And also some of the characters. I just didn't really take to some of the characters. For example, Lulu. I don't want to talk too much about Lulu because I don't want to spoil too much. I'll talk about the narrative in a bit in a moment, but I just didn't really like the character, and maybe we're not meant to, but I didn't like to dislike the character. Some of the characters' dialogue was quite interesting. There was a little bit of comedy from the character, or at least things that I found funny. But generally, most of the characters were not as likable as I'd hoped. This focuses initially on Krypto the Superdog, and Krypto finds himself on a mission of his own, and he has to team up with these other pets, most of which are rescue pets, to try and solve this problem and rescue Superman. Before watching it, I wasn't aware that the main superheroes, Superman, Wonder Woman, etc., I won't name any more, I don't want to spoil it, but I wasn't aware that they played a role in it, in the narrative, quite so heavily, even though they're not in it that much. And that aspect of it worked very well. I was just under the impression that it was basically just DC but in pet form, but actually it's got a much more well-developed narrative concept. The idea of it is very fascinating. I just feel like the execution of the narrative maybe wasn't as great as it could have been. The problems that the animals encountered generally weren't that interesting. Some of them were, some of them I did think, I genuinely don't know how they're going to get around this or how they're going to resolve this, but I feel like it needed a bit more work to make it a bit more interesting and flow a little bit more smoothly. There were some bits that I found to be actually quite funny, but it wasn't as funny as I was expecting. And because of that, and with the narrative not really being as gripping as I'd hoped, it just meant that it wasn't quite that smooth, pleasant journey that I was expecting and hoping for, and to be honest, is the kind of thing that we get with these films, but it just didn't live up to my expectations. But I seem to be maybe quite alone in that, because, as I said, it's got quite a high rating on IMDb at the very least. It seems to have done quite well. It's got a meta score of 56, which is not terrible. And there are great things about it. The quality of the animation is very sharp, and the soundtrack is wonderful, and it does get a little bit emotional at certain times. Now, I have mentioned this before, even with animated animal films, I find them difficult to watch because I find them too sentimental. But actually, this one wasn't that emotional. It had its moments, though. So if you are like me in that regard, don't let your guard down straight away, because there are moments that are quite heartfelt and very, very moving, and I found those to be, well, it helped to move things along when the narrative itself maybe wasn't that fabulous. So did I enjoy it? I didn't love it, but there were bits in it that I thought worked quite well, and I would recommend it if you are interested in it. But I can't imagine it's one I'd watch again. Maybe when I've seen some of the DC films that I haven't seen, maybe I'll come back and watch it, and maybe there'll be things in it I didn't pick up on, references I didn't get. I don't know. But certainly for the younger audience, I do think it's got a lot going for it. I think there's a lot in it that could appeal. For an older audience, if you're a DC fan, I think you'll probably get something out of it. But if you don't like DC, I mean, maybe it goes without saying, but I'd say you're probably not going to enjoy it. I don't think there's enough in it to make it a quality film for everybody. I do think it's for a specific audience, a DC fan audience, or if you're new to DC as well. But if you don't like DC, maybe it's obvious, but I would say maybe avoid this one. But otherwise, give it a go. It's not terrible. I'm glad I've seen it. It just wasn't as great as I was expecting.